welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farron, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Mathias Nordvik.
Hello. We are joined this time by Sofie Draheim, who is an author working on a book where you're basically like doing modern Scaldic poetry, as far as I understand it. Aside from that, Sofie, you have a BA in Scandinavian Studies from UCL with a brief trip to Oslo, and then you also are doing an MA in creative writing. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys very, very much for having me. It's kind of surreal to be here, but I'm very glad to join you all.
Yeah, thank you. And it's good to hear a good Northern accent as well. I know you said it's a hybrid, but I'm taking it as Northern. And you're not taking that away from me.
If I'm being accepted by a Northerner as a fellow Northerner in England, then I'm feeling very flattered. So no, it's all good by me.
even if it's the wrong side of the Pennines and it's Lancashire, I'm still going to allow it just because I don't get many Northern English people on here.
Great, awesome. Yeah.
So before we jump into the Scaldic poetry side stuff, there's a couple of things I want to touch on and ask Mathias. Obviously, there's been a few things discovered recently. Firstly, Mathias, before we speak about the little eagle, raven, Odin head that was found, I need to ask you, what the fuck is a rune? I've forgotten what it was called. A birth rune? What the fuck's a birth rune? Because I was scrolling through Facebook, as I do, getting myself into all sorts of trouble in the groups, and I saw somebody post about how their birth rune was a specific one and gave this big detailed answer about why.
Right.
And I had to come and ask you what the fuck this was, because I feel like it's some sort of star sign modern interpretation of runes. Yeah,
so let me just flip through a book for a second here. And if anybody's got their bingo cards up, then or bingo plays up, then I guess you can check that one off. Because like I feel like there's.
Don't tell me it's real, because I'm going to be so upset if it is.
No.
Sofie, I don't know if it's something you've ever heard of before.
Like
what, a birth rune?
A birth rune. And it just feels extremely bizarre a thing. I feel it must be a modern creation, but is
it like the kind of like quasi-Nordic version of a star sign, or like a zodiac?
That's kind of what I was feeling it was.
Yeah.
But as always, I like to bring these things to Mathias so he can tell me whether, because it always seems to be the ones that I'm never expecting to be real are always the ones that are
obviously
true.
What you were the stuff that you referenced for me is definitely like some kind of like modern idea. I don't know where they got this from. And like I had never heard of it before, like birth runes. But I just wanted to like check up on like the main poem that is like the sort of like the cause of all kinds of like funky ideas about runes. That would be the poem Sigurdrifamal. Or the Lay of Sigurdriva, as it is called in English, where we have this Valkyrie who is like listing all of these different funky runes, like ale runes, helping runes, sea runes, limb runes, speech runes, mind runes, and a bunch of other stuff. And so there is in stanza 9, she says, helping runes you must know if you want to assist and release children from women. They shall be cut on the palms and clasped on the joints, and then the Deseer asked for help. So this is not birth runes as such. That's like runes associated with the idea of like healing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
It's not like a rune to help give birth.
yeah, no, that's the whole thing. It's not the person giving birth or the person being birthed. It's
Born.
the born. There you go. Hey, I'm foreign. It's the midwife basically who's like using these runes on their hands. So that's like an entirely different thing. But I could see how that could somehow end up as like an interpretation of like birth runes that has something to do with like a rune that is like assigned to the child in like some kind of new age modern interpretation. So like, yeah, it's something that people have come up with, pulled out of their asses, but we could, authenticate the idea of, based off of that poem, I think, to an extent, if we really want to make that stretch. So yeah, but if somebody says, hey, my birth rune was this and that, then they're basically just interpreting runes in context of like astrology or something.
Mm-hmm. That's what it seemed. It seemed like it was a day that you were born, you got a certain rune, maybe.
Yeah, and
it gave you magical powers.
I mean, I could definitely see that being a thing nowadays. Like you sort of like you do runic divination once the child has been born, and then it gets like a specific rune. There's a lot of creative thinking that has to go into using runes in that way, but they get used for a lot of funky stuff nowadays. So why the hell not?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Okay, and the second thing I want to ask you before we start properly is the little figurehead that has been found in Zealand. At the time of us recording this, I think it was found yesterday. It'll probably be a couple of weeks old by the time this gets released. So we'll talk about it, where just whatever you basically just educate me on it, I guess. I think, Sophie, you said you haven't seen it either. So Mike's got some images to pull up for the video, the people watching on video.
Nice.
So yeah, so this was found, what did you say, yesterday?
Yeah. I think it's about 24 hours old. Metal detector find in Denmark, Zealand. And what we're seeing is a little male head. He has a very distinct beard. And and so the interesting thing is that he's got like, what do you call that thing, like a mohawk kind of thing going on that turns into a bird's head. Now the interesting thing is that he doesn't look like he's wearing a helmet, this figure. It actually looks like it's like his hair or something. I'm not entirely sure.
It's like a little Elvis Presley quiff
that's like turning into a bird's head. And then of course now the conversation is that a raven's head or is it a eagle head? And conversations are also of course circling around, is this Odin, is it not Odin? What are we dealing with? One of the basic things we can say about it is that this is of course a depiction of a male head that falls in line with what we know from Vendel era. The Swedes call it the Vendel era. The rest of us call it the migration era. So that period.
I was just about to ask that. What period is that?
Well, that's like from 400-500s into the early 700s at the very latest is where we see this common Nordic and Northern European culture that also, the Anglo-Saxons definitely are part of. Like we talked about this in context of the Sutton Hoo when we had Martin Carver on the Sutton Hoo burials. Like a lot of the art that we see in the Sutton Hoo burial is very similar to the style that you see in the Vendel graves in Sweden, hence their use of the word Vendel era. And this is a common sort of like warrior ruler culture that is emerging in the 500s in Northern Europe, tied specifically to local magnates in the Scandinavian area in general, but definitely with like ties to the Franks and the Goths and a lot of inspiration from these emerging feudal societies in Western Europe at the time. So what can we say about it? Well, it falls in line with the warrior ideology that seems attached to a mythological figure like Odin. And then that makes a lot of people interpret these bird heads as ravens, because sort of like the most popular version of Odin is like this god that hangs out with a couple of ravens on his shoulders, even though that's like a really far stretched interpretation that Snorri Sturluson comes up with in the 1220s based off of a very vague reference in the poem Grimnir Sayings. So it's not necessarily... I feel like
Sofie must agree with you because she was smiling then.
Well, she probably knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not like Odin is not associated with ravens. It's just that there's, the idea that Odin and ravens go hand in hand is perhaps blown a little out of proportion. Mm-hmm. And Odin as a figure, as this like mythological figure, is also associated with eagles. In different ways. Mm-hmm. Like one of his names is Arnahöfdi, which literally means eagle head. So there's that, and so of course the big thing is like, where do these northwestern Europeans in that time period get these ideas from? Like, what is it that inspires their consistent imagery associated with these birds of prey, probably eagles, maybe ravens, but more probably eagles? And that's, of course, the answer is Imperial Rome, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we have seen in like so much imagery in Imperial Rome, basically like just precipitating north, and in different ways inspiring and creating new cultural forms in Northern Europe. The Brechtiates are a great example. I've ranted about those before. These like, golden medallions that have all kinds of like funky imagery on them in the Germanic context, and in the Roman context, we have more like naturalistic imagery. You can actually see what's on them. These were like medallions that the Roman legions would wear. The Germanics, they look at them and then they go, "Oh, that's really cool. Let's copy that." And then they use their own like funky, creative, very sort of like almost like acid trips, Pablo Picasso kind of like style in the imagery that they put on them, and then a bunch of runes and like magic words that we have very little understanding of today. And there you go, Germanic mythology and ideology for the 500s. So yeah, that's I guess what we can say about that in general. Of course, there's a lot of, it has to go through the whole processing of like specialists looking at it and telling us what they think.
Are those the only pictures that are kind of out there at the minute?
Yeah, I've seen 3.
It looks like a pencil topper to me.
It does, doesn't it? It does look like you can like put it on something.
Yeah, it's like on the end of your pencil. It'd be really cool. Like it'd be made of rubber, just in case you make an error.
No, you're totally right. But it's like one thing I would say is that I feel like it gets a little weird sometimes when both scholars and layfolk want to like really obsess about the species of bird that we're dealing with here. You know, bird of prey would just be fine, if you ask me, because we don't always really have the capacity to actually, you know, determine is it also like, oh yeah, sure, eagle, but what kind of eagle? There's several kinds of eagles, guys. Come on, like let's get real specific then.
Sophie, what now you've seen it, do you have any opinions on what you think it might be? Whether it's, I guess you can't really tell whether it's an eagle or a raven or what.
I mean, like my, as we call it in Britain, like twitcher skills, like my bird identifying abilities are little to none. So I would have no idea in a million worlds what on earth that is. But pencil eraser springs to mind more than like a specific type of bird for me as well, Daniel. That helps. So,
Matthias, is it likely that? I mean, I don't know how many eagles you get in Northern Europe.
Plenty of eagles.
Because I was wondering whether maybe it changed from eagles to ravens, kind of geographically where you were, depending on what birds you saw. So you just kind of made it fit.
There are eagles all over the place in Northern Europe. Like Denmark still has eagles today. So yeah, the eagle is would have been a well-known bird to these people, and they would definitely have. You could go to Nordic mythology and read the myths, and there are plenty of eagles there too. There is a whole quite an interesting sort of like deep-rooted complex of eagle mythology in Nordic mythology in general. So it makes perfect sense that it would be an eagle, if you ask me.
Okay. So why?
But it also could make perfect sense that it would be a raven. Actually, like there's plenty of like raven mythology in there as well. So
why the big obsession with ravens in Nordic mythology then? Or it seems to like a lay person like me, I'm sure there is some eagles in there, but it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on ravens.
I mean, we have a couple of poetic examples where ravens are specifically mentioned and addressed as sort of like the primary mythological and also death associated creature, right? Because of warrior mythology and warrior ideology in different ways, the raven symbolizes that animal, or is that animal that basically shows up and starts picking at your guts when you're lying there dead at the battlefield, right? And that is an image that was very popular in Scaldic poetry and Nordic mythology in general. We see the raven then showing up as sort of like a harbinger of death. That becomes a very stable element later in the saga literature and in folklore in general as well. So the raven is part of like a very, very like sort of big mythological complex in Scandinavia and Northern Europe in general.
Whereas I feel like sorry.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that the one thing that came to mind from like a literary perspective is that eagles and ravens are both quite prevalent in sort of poetic, like kenning terms. You have like kennings for, war is like feeding the eagle, is specifically referring to it as a bird of prey that's going to come and feast on corpses. But you also have, I think it is, I might be corrected on this, but I think there's one which is like raven's wine, or like something that the raven is going to feed on. So there's quite an equal balance in what I've seen in kennings for eagles and ravens. So like, I think they're both fairly prevalent as like harbingers of war in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and also falcons and hawks, right? Like it's like this. Yeah. It's sort of like a general like concept of like a bird of prey, or a bird that will feast on the dead in one way or another. They're generally used, right, in these images of war. I think one of the reasons that the raven in particular is like, sort of like etched into the minds of like the layperson when it comes to this is that Odin is always depicted with those two fucking ravens for some reason, and I'm cursing because it's kind of annoying me a little bit because it's so obviously a construction that Snorri Sturluson makes in the 1200s. That doesn't mean that he's not associated with ravens, but it's just not that, you know, two parrots kind of like I'm Jack Sparrow situation that we're dealing with here. It's something else. You also have Haraldskvæði, right? The eulogy to Harold Finehair, where it begins with a conversation between a Valkyrie and a raven. So that's like a very sort of distinct and well-used image as well. So yeah, that's probably why the raven is so popular. Mm-hmm. And as I was going to say, in context of like Scandinavian folk lore in general, like later on in the medieval period and after the medieval period, is that the eagle stops being particularly active in that sense. It stops being relevant in folk lore and folk tales and folk mythology in general, whereas the raven like is like a consistent image. And I think also in the English area and Scotland and so on, if I am not mistaken.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for anywhere else, but you see a lot of ravens. You don't see many eagles. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that's probably plays a part to it. Because if there's ever anything dead, there's always a fucking raven flying above it.
That's a good point, actually.
I feel like you write about what you know. Just going back to what you just said, Sophie, I had an interesting thought. It's probably the only one that comes up in my mind. Do you think they ever just used a particular bird because the word rhymed easier, especially when it comes to like Scaldic stuff? Because at the end of the day, they are humans, and I guess it would be no different to a poet today. They would just pick a word. They're like, "Oh, that fits. I'm just going to go with that." And I imagine that must have been the same.
I mean, in my opinion. And it is entirely my opinion, absolutely, because as I was like ranting a little bit about earlier, if you have such strict rules to stick to in meters such as Drottningvaart or Runhent or other like Scaldic meters, which have very specific rules, you could be really inspired one day. You could see a raven descending on a corpse and you're like, I have to incorporate that into my poetry later as a skald. And you're just sitting there and you're mapping out exactly how many syllables per line that you can actually use and how many half rhymes or full rhymes or alliteration. And if eagle is going to somehow fit the bill better than raven, I personally...
You saw an eagle.
Yeah, exactly. If I was in that position, I would have no problem in changing my story just because is it worth me changing the rest of my Scaldic composition to fit this one word? Because it is already so hard to like get everything to match up that maybe I would just be a lazy skald. I don't know. Maybe there would be skalds who would like labor to like describe things exactly as they see them. But in my opinion, you would definitely bend what you were trying to say just to fit into those really anal, pedantic, rules that you have in Scaldic poetry. So
haiku from hell. That's what it is.
Yep.
So before we go into the Scaldic poetry, the last thing I want to say on the little figure is that I hope that it turns out to be Odin, because he's got both his eyes. And I'm going to find that fucker that argued with me about Odin, about having a symbol of Odin with two eyes. I'm going to find him and I'm going to send him it. So, because I'm a vengeful bastard. I'm spiteful.
I feel like I've missed some huge drama here where you were attacked.
No. I had a little conversation with somebody about how Odin could be depicted with two eyes, and he got upset with me. So, but then Matthias embarrassed me by telling everybody that there is no depiction of Odin with two eyes. So I've been waiting for one. I've been waiting for one.
I mean, the thing is that we don't have much to go by when it comes to these depictions from like the Viking age or before, because I mean they don't come with name tags. So all we can do is that we can we can look at the features of this particular whatever it is that's being depicted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can relate those features to what we know from, other cultural material, and that would usually be the written material that we have from medieval Iceland, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we always run into that annoying situation of like a time gap of several hundred years between when that particular thing was used and produced and used, and then when stuff was written down. And that's always the back and forth. A hardcore positivist would say that, well, you can't do that. You can't use texts that were written down 2,000 kilometers away from the place of finding something, several hundred years after that thing was produced, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is, of course, it's going to make for really boring Scandinavian archaeology from that time period. But it is, to an extent, also a valid argument. So, I mean, when it comes to like Odin with one or two eyes, we really have to consider how important is it that he only has one eye. And
it's important to me that he has two.
The thing is that there is there's not a lot of literary evidence for him just having one eye. There's also not a lot of literary evidence for him having two eyes. Like, it doesn't look like it's that fucking important in the stories. It's like the Ravens.
It's just two idiots on Facebook who made it important.
And a bunch of other idiots out there, in different contexts. Also, scholarly idiots. So don't worry about it. Like, this is something that you can also find long ass debates about at some conference somewhere.
Yeah.
So
no, we can all just agree that little figure's Odin with two eyes, and we can move on, I think.
Absolutely.
So let's get to Scaldic poetry, because I think we've touched on it before a little bit. I still don't think I'm 100% clear on what it actually is. So if I'm not clear, I'm sure people listening also aren't. So Sofie, do you want to give us a little rundown of what Scaldic poetry is?
Well, I can attempt to, but having come from a quite generalist undergraduate degree in Scandinavian studies, I'm sort of only more focusing on the literary side with Scaldic poetry now at a master's level in creative writing. So I will probably be fresh to this and make blunders and whatever, but as I understand it, there's a lot of debate within Scaldic poetry about, things such as whether music was involved, which I know you guys have discussed before. And as I understand it, there's no material evidence to say yes, and there's none to say no. So who are we to assume yes or no on that? It's completely open to history. We're not sure. But there's, as I've learned about it, I assume that a lot of Eddic poetry is has been left anonymous. We're not exactly sure with the Eddic poetry who has composed it, but Scaldic poetry, it was very about courtly poetry and composing, for kings and chieftains. So it would be a thing of renown to be a famous Skald who was composing very important poetry to commemorate the war deeds or the exploits of a king or a chieftain. And one of the most prevalent meters there is I'm probably saying it completely wrong as well, but the Brechtiates, as I have read it before, translates to suitable for the court, the courtly meter. This was what would be the meter that was used to compose poetry for chieftains and kings quite often. And this all plays into the reciprocal nature between liege lords and retainers, retainers who would be wanting to compose poetry for their lords, and they would perhaps receive favor in return in, gifts or other favors from their lord and things like that. So it was very important in an oral tradition for chieftains and kings to be recorded in poetry that might be passed around, as opposed to any physical evidence of their exploits. If we're ignoring the whole runestone side of it, which is quite limited in its own way, in my perspective. So but yeah, there are several different meters within Scaldic poetry that were used, but like that's quite a good example of one that was very complicated and required a lot of mental dexterity to master. Like there's specific features and a certain number of syllables and alliterations and rhymes that were required, and you would have to be very good at it, well practiced at it, to kind of earn fame as a skald. And if you were rubbish and you got the wrong number of syllables and you were, performing it in a courtly setting, then I'm sure you would be booed out just like any kind of modern performer, and, in my opinion. But yeah, so it was quite a difficult thing to achieve, I would say, to be like a renowned skald in a specific meter or whatever, as a summary, in my opinion. But yeah.
Feels like they were the rock stars of the Viking age.
They definitely were. And
the slam poets.
The slam poets, because that was also part of it, right? They would actually compose poetry to fuck with each other, and it's like, look at this asshole over here, that kind of stuff. And some of them would get bynames that also hinted at them being bad skalds, like Eyvindur Skáldaspillir, which just means shitty skald. So imagine getting that nickname. Like, that's one you've got to try and shake, isn't it? But it's also there's a couple of things that are interesting also about Scaldic poetry in terms of like how we think about it today. It's very closely associated with, as Sofie was pointing out, kings and chieftains and so on, and the eulogies attributed to them. But I mean, some of the oldest mythology that we also have, presumably at least, because it's attributed to certain skalds, is composed by skalds as well, like Höstlung, as a so-called Scaldic poem, though not in Trottkveit meter, right? So we're dealing with a somewhat of like a genre confusion in different ways. Thorstraupa is another one, right? So we have like these like very old sources to Nordic mythology in Scaldic sources as well, and the question is like where does Scaldic poetry begin, and where does Eddic poetry end? As I have surely said before, Eddic poetry is also like 5 or 6 or 7 different kinds of meter as well. It's not just one thing. And what we basically have,
What's the difference between Eddic poetry and Scaldic poetry?
The meter in which it is composed, and also quite often.
What's a meter?
That's when.
Oh fuck!
You have a bunch of stressed and unstressed syllables and alliteration.
What's a stressed syllable?
Oh fuck. So when you compose something,
I'm not going to be the only person thinking this.
I know that's fair. Okay, so when you compose poetry, right, you set it up in a repeating structure, right? That's clear. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the type of poetry that we in the modern Western world are mostly familiar with is like poetry that has end rhymes. Mm-hmm. So
that's what I'm most familiar with.
Yes, that was the stuff that you were trying to compose before, and thinking like, what rhymes with podcast, right? Oh, yeah. And so so different types of poetry will have different rules for how you make rhymes in rhymes, for instance. And so that will be the meter, right? The meter will be the rules for how you make rhymes. Yeah. Okay. But
so could you say rules?
Poetry, in a sense, yes. But it's more like it's a little more complicated than simply just like saying rules, right? Because then we have different types of rules, and we also have different what you say, like logics for how you create the rules. So when it comes to this Nordic type of poetry and Germanic poetry in general, what is the main rule or the main guiding principle in creating rules is the alliteration, right? So you don't make rhyming in the same way as we're familiar with in modern art forms. You make rhyming based off of alliteration instead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
that's where stressed and unstressed syllables and all that crap comes into play. And so you get these many different types of poetry, actually, because we have, identified in what we call Eddic poetry, we identified at least 6 different ways of creating these rules. Right? And as far as I remember, we have one of the most primary ones is like fornidslag, which means something like the meter of ancient sayings or ancient words. Mm-hmm. And that would be like the prophecy of the seeress, right? Mm-hmm. And let's see. So what is it? Let's just take it. So stanza 3 of the prophecy of the seeress, how does that go? It goes, Arvas aldar, da ymir byggdi, vara sander ni se ni svala unnir. Jörfan skeiva ni upp himmin, Gapvas gingunga engrasverki, or something like that, right? So you can hear that the alliteration here is on the consonants, and instead of like these end rhymes that have to like match up with one another. Does that make sense?
Sounds complicated.
It is complicated.
Sounds really difficult to do.
Yes. And then you know what these bastards did? And then they created Drottqveit as an entirely different, even more complicated type of poetry later on, right?
Okay.
And that's what Sofie is working with.
It sounds horrendous.
The thing, I think you're being very generous in saying that I'm working with it. I sort of sat down very optimistic because I was having a joke around, like on the Scandinavian Studies BA I was doing, we had some kind of like banter going on about what like profession would you most likely be able to survive and thrive in during, Viking age or prior. And I have no idea because I have little to no, practical survival skills, but I can sort of talk out my ass with poetry and stories sometimes. So I was like, maybe if I was a Skald, I might get by. And so I sort of had this kind of like very can-do attitude to it. And then I sat down with Drottqveit and the rules set out in front of me, for want of a better word. And I was like, yeah, no problem. Absolutely fine. And I wanted to cry within about 5 or 10 minutes and rip up the paper in front of me, which I'm sure was quite a familiar feeling to Skalds back in the day as well. Mm-hmm. People just getting so frustrated with it because it feels very limiting. But the result, if it's done well, is beautiful. But when you're trying to learn how to do it in an unfamiliar way, it just feels like unnecessary constrictions on what you are trying to express. It's very frustrating, and I haven't really done that much in it, but I'm hoping that I will learn a bit of patience in my life and try again in future and actually do a bit better next time. So, yeah. Is
it something that's mainly adapted to older languages and just doesn't suit modern English very well? Or that's
my excuse. That's my excuse. I'm like, yeah, English. It just doesn't work with English. English is too ugly a language compared to the beautiful, long syllable words of kind of Old Icelandic or Norse languages. But I'm sure, I'm a big, one of my idols is Ian Crockett. He's a Scottish poet. And I think he has a PhD in Scandinavian studies or something from Aberdeen University. And he's like done a lot of translations of like Orkneyinga saga and like a lot of the poetry of the sagas. And he just understands it. He just gets it. And he's written an entire poetry anthology, which I'm very jealous of, called Skald, Sword and Sea Cloud. And he basically the entire thing is what I want to do in my own way. It's all in different meters derived from like Throdkvite and other types like Edic meters and Scaldic meters. And it works for him, but it doesn't work for me normally when I do it. So he's very, very good. But I mean, if you look at the language he's using, he's having to pair words that you would never in a million years put together in a modern context. So it's a very different, archaic take on language that I think we're kind of, in a way, Dan, we're kind of grown away from. But like, I'm sure if you spent enough time like Ian has, like probably leafing through a thesaurus and really thinking about it, you would actually manage to make something beautiful. But it doesn't come so naturally now, perhaps because one reason or another. So yeah.
My biggest problem with all that stuff is that I couldn't care less about rules in general. So I'm like, well, fuck it.
Same. Yeah. I mean, that's the problem, is same. It's kind of like a challenge thing. I don't really care for the rules, but it seems like it would be very fulfilling to master something that has in the past been mastered. And when I can't, I feel very frustrated, and then I sort of start criticizing. Oh, well, the rules are stupid anyway, and start basically bashing on everything. Bashing on everything I've been bashing on everything I've been studying for years, which is very self-destructive. So there's kind of no point in that either.
I imagine it's probably one of those things that once it clicks and you kind of just see it and get it and go from there. But until that moment, it just feels like you're bashing your head against a wall.
Yeah,
absolutely.
In my opinion,
yeah.
And I never plan on finding out.
I mean, this is one of the reasons that it can be incredibly difficult to translate Scaldic poetry, obviously, but also the other types of poetry from medieval Iceland and that Viking Age past and all that stuff, because you will always have to like give up some aspect of the original text that you're working with when you're translating it. That's also why we often see like sort of more weird archaicisms in translations of like Eddic poems. They get weirdly archaic because sometimes archaic English just works better for it in some translators' opinions, at least.
I imagine you get a lot of mistranslations as well, because even if I read modern poetry, which I don't do very often, but there's some stuff in there that means one thing, and I look at it in English and I understand English quite a bit, and I'm like, that's a stretch for that to mean that, but obviously it fits within the poem, so they've put it in there. And I imagine that would have been the same for back there. So when you're then trying to translate from this dead language to now, that makes it even more difficult to understand what it is, because it might be quite a stretch and off topic then, let alone now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when you talk about that, like that kind of brings to mind the whole subject of kennings, which I'm quite a nerd for and I find very interesting. So like,
what's a kenning?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. So I was mentally stealing myself. I guess the best way of describing it is kind of like it's a metaphor, trying to express the meaning of something through a compound, like a combination of two different words that are very reliant on cultural context sometimes. So something, for instance, like blood, a kenning for blood is battle sweat. That's not really that hard to figure out for us, right? Like we can, that's not too difficult for us, but there might be something like Mimir's lip streams, meaning poetry, which is very reliant on your knowledge of Nordic myths and things like that, and your understanding of Mimir and kind of the origins of the mead of poetry. And
Jim in the chat has just said it's like Cockney rhyming slang, which from what you said, I feel like that fits quite well.
I think so, because you always feel really, I don't know, like FOMO, like you're missing out when people are speaking it around you and you've got no idea what they're referring to. It's like an in-joke that you're missing out on, but worse. And I mean, I've read some things conflicting, but there's some kind of opinions that perhaps like the superfluous use of like lots and lots of kennings in poetry, like Scaldic poetry, might have been a kind of distinguishing thing of like you had to be a certain amount of culturally aware and perhaps aristocratic in order to be like aware of the kind of literary history that's behind it in order to be able to actually write or compose these poems in ways that fit in with cultural context, if that makes any sense. So but I mean I love them, and when I'm writing kind of like anything that's a bit more fantasy, my own kind of fiction, I have a great deal of fun making up my own kennings that fit in with the world I'm building. But you could do the same for like modern day London or England, things that are culturally relevant to a certain place or a certain location and time. But yeah.
No, I think I get it. It's like a way of describing something without actually saying it. But
yes, that's way better than me rambling on for the last 5 minutes. That basically sums it up.
Actually, I would have to say, I would have to modify that and say it's actually a way of describing something by describing a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So that's really
Matthias,
exactly.
I mean, that I feel like that must be incredibly difficult for people to then translate the old texts of poems into English now, and you must get sort of different answers depending on who reads it, who translates it.
You can definitely get so there's a couple of things when it comes to especially like the kenningar in Scaldic poetry that are a little problematic. Okay, so first of all, the kenningar in Scaldic poetry are the reason we have Nordic mythology. Like Snorri Sturluson wrote his book Edda because he wanted people to be able to decipher these kenningar in Scaldic poetry, because they're so often based on Nordic mythology, right? Because it's an old cultural language. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, that because of these weird circumlocutions that people came up with, that's why we still know Nordic mythology today, because there was an Icelander that said like this is still relevant knowledge, even though we converted to Christianity and all that stuff. So that's the first thing to keep in mind here. The bulk of Nordic mythology is just lists of like, oh, you can call gold Freya's tears, or you can call gold the mouthful of what is Ivaldi's sons or something like that. And then you get like these weird random stories about why you can do that. So that's really what Snorri Sturluson is writing down back in the 1220s. But so that's like one person's interpretation, right? And yeah, sure, he was very learned in that style. He knew what he was doing most of the time. But sometimes we do run into interpretive issues in different ways. And especially when you look at what contemporary or near contemporary scholars have been doing with Scaldic poetry as well, quite often. So like if you take Finnur Jonsson's big dictionary of
all right, what you were going to say then.
What?
No, it's all right, don't you worry about it. Everybody listening will have got that.
Okay, so Finnur Jonsson, right? He wrote Norsk-Islandsk Skjaldiktning, the big dictionary on this subject. I have it right here, and
you've got a way of pronouncing dictionary. It's really cracking me up.
I don't really understand what's going on.
You emphasize the dick in dictionary quite well, and especially when you put it with the word big before it, it sounds.
Well, it is a big dictionary.
Got
this is just one volume of it. Anyway.
I mean, I thought you were just flattering the author.
I mean, you never know.
Who knows?
So, moving on from ancient scholars' dicks to the subject at hand. So what he did is that he, of course, compiled a dictionary on all of this stuff, and quite often what you're seeing is that, like the entries, you'll have, a reference to, say, a giant or something like this, and then our good friend just basically says, "Oh, that's a giant," except. You could make an argument for actually in the particular kenning interpreting the giant's name and the context for that giant in the whole context of the kenning itself, and then ask yourself what kind of meaning is that kenning actually creating in that particular scenario right there. And then it starts getting really interesting, because then you can get some funky stuff. And that's when we have basically these circumlocutions are like basically unveiling an entire world of imagination as well. So what we're basically dealing with here are multiple layers of interpretation. Like the top layer is oh, that kenning right there just means giant. But then you ask yourself, all these components, there can be 4 components of a kenning sometimes. What do they actually tell you about that giant and about that scene and about that situation in of itself? And then you get deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's one of the things that I really love to do with this material and myself. So that's my long rant about that. And I forgot where we came from anyway.
We came from the difficulties of translating the kennings.
Exactly. So then you ask yourself, if we're dealing with these multiple layers of interpretation, right, and meaning that can be, and one of the best examples of several layers of meaning in Scaldic poetry and kennings is that little quote unquote praise stanza or 2, I think it is, that Egill Skallagrimsson composes to the English king. Ethelred, I think it is, in Egil's saga, because what he does is that he's sitting there. Egil is pissed off because his brother has just died in battle, and he's mad at the king. The king knows this, so the king hands him a golden ring as sort of cheer up, buddy, on the tip of his sword. Yeah, the tip of his sword. And then Egil takes it, and then he composes this little thank you note, which is basically also a fuck you note, because he's literally he's using all of this imagery that basically calls the king a warmonger, right? So you can see how there are different levels here. The king, who doesn't really understand what Scaldic poetry is, just thinks it's a thank you. But everybody else who's there who does understand Scaldic poetry basically also understands that Egil is really pissed off, and he thinks the king is just a usurper and a warmonger. Okay?
I feel like I'd be like the king in this situation. That would be me. I'd just be like, oh, thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask, would there have been female Skalds? Is that something we know of, or would it have been like most things back then, just typically male and boring?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to take it, Sofie?
Sofie?
I'm going to hand this over to the man in the conversation as befits the conversation, because I'm not that familiar. I've heard, I'll hand this one over because I am not an expert on it, ironically, but yeah.
I think there are a couple of references to female skulls. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I think there's a handful, and. Okay. I know that there are scholars who have written on this subject, and I know that I've read their articles on it, but it's more than 10 years ago, unfortunately. So I can't remember exactly how the argument goes, but I think there is the assumption that there was a portion of skulls that were women. You also always have to take into account, of course, that the material that we have available to us is the tip of the iceberg, right? Mm-hmm. There is so much that is lost. Like one thing is just when you look at it in terms of regions, most of the Scaldic poetry that we have is focused on Western Norway, a little bit of North Central Norway, and preserved in Iceland, right? And then, of course, also Iceland is a theme, or Icelanders. But we know for a fact that, the Swedes and the Danes had skalds way into the 1200s as well. And so there must have been a tradition that was like very focused on, say, like, for instance, the Swedish area. And the Swedish kings as well, in a much more intense way than what we see in the material that we have available to us. We also know that there were skalds in Scotland and the English courts, and there must have been much more material focused on that area as well. So much is lost, and we just really can't say. But it is. It's very possible that there was a much more vibrant living tradition than what we're seeing in the available material, right?
Go on.
No, it's just a quick thing. I was wondering if Matthias knew anything about, because I've heard kind of vague discussions about is it Mansöngr, the kind of like love poetry that was kind of the version of like old Icelandic or Scaldic poetry that was dedicated to like love poems, erotic poems, for courting women and things. As I understood it, but I might be completely wrong on this, I've heard that it was quite like quite a frowned upon form of like courtship and poetry, because it was often intrusive on like pre-arranged marriages and things like that. I was just wondering if there was anything you could enlighten on that, because I'm quite unfamiliar with the subject, but I found it pretty interesting when I skimmed the surface before.
Right.
But
so
if you know,
one of the things I like, the disclaimer on all of this stuff is always these attitudes to art, culture, rocks, everything that we talk about, right? They're always written down and expressed in Iceland. So that's a specific, cultural context. And this is something I feel scholarship in general ignores a little too much, that Iceland in the Viking Age and the medieval period is a very, very different society from the rest. Like, it's actually incredibly distinct in so many ways. One of the ways is that they seem to generally have a lack of females in Iceland, which means that the men are incredibly competitive. Like, just think about that for a second. What kind of society does that create, right? I'm just saying here that there's something to that in and of itself.
Do you want an answer to that, or?
Yeah.
I imagine a shitty one.
Yeah, right. As Matt is commenting in the chat, ook.
Yeah, that's a good description of how I imagine it would go.
Yeah, right. So especially when it comes to these things of like love and how you express that, how you make unions of various kinds, love-based, or basically just like some sort of like utilitarian arranged marriage situation and all that stuff, that might be very distinctly Icelandic. Just keep that in mind, right? So we can't say much about like what was this like in Viking Age Norway or Viking Age Sweden or Viking Age Denmark in the same way, because we just don't have available sources in the same way. We have the rune stones that can give us some insight, but not a lot of insight, right? And especially not a lot of insight in terms of like, was arranged marriages, for instance, the standard? Was arranged marriages perhaps something that the upper class cared about, but maybe the rest of society didn't. And when we look at the medieval laws, we actually kind of get the sense that, arranged marriages was a thing for the upper class and not so much for the rest.
It seems like it would make sense, though.
Yeah, because like the upper class is focused on basically
land and getting more money.
Yeah, exactly.
Keeping themselves rich.
Yes,
you can't have your daughter marrying a peasant.
Yeah. So
no matter how big his dictionary is.
So that tells me then, right, that if that's the situation that we have, then perhaps Mannsöngr, love poetry and so on, could have been much more prevalent. It's sort of like in the broad population, and maybe it was scoffed on as and considered annoying or intrusive by these so-called important people, because it was like fucking with their plans. But maybe this was a very common way that the quote-unquote commoners would court each other.
This is getting very, very Romeo and Juliet. So are we talking about just love poems?
Mm-hmm.
That's how very Viking. Like,
sorry, we should never.
No, I want to know more about it. I'm glad you did. So
it's not very Viking.
Well, it doesn't matter. So what? It's just a case of writing a nice little poem for somebody. Is it a case of more like an appreciation of love already established, or is it pretty much for the purpose of new love interests?
You asking me or
anybody who can give me the answer on this? I'm really interested in it.
But it's the whole range, right? It's also like romantic love, all the way to just carnal lust of various kinds. Mm-hmm. And it's what's really interesting to see is, of course, that we have stories that in so many weird ways include very raunchy scenes and like basically sort of like locker room talk kind of stuff too. I mean,
so do we have a Vikings 50 Shades of Grey? That's all I want to know.
Yeah, we do.
do we really?
I think we have a Vikings hustler. I mean,
okay.
Or like something even more. Like Bosa Saga is an example of something that gets like pretty pornographic. And we talked a little bit about this when we had Kais on. That's the saga where the hero sees two giants wrestling, and it's a male and a female, and then he also spots that the female giant's genitalia is hanging down from under her skirt, and it's like described. Yeah. So that's a thing.
Okay. I just didn't expect firstly this episode to go this direction, and secondly for this to even exist.
I mean, like I think I was kind of, is it Cormac's saga where he's very infatuated with a Steingerder, the woman, and it's all very like airy fairy romantic, like Romeo and Juliet style. And then that's kind of the angle I was going in at, not the kind of giant woman's drooping genitalia, but either way, like, it's interesting. It's two sides of the same coin. Yeah.
Well, exactly, right. We span the whole range.
So with these were these composed to be said face to face or publicly, or do we not know? Was it like a one-on-one kind of romantic thing, or did you profess your love in front of everybody and let this lovely poem go that you'd written?
Hey, so I took it to the giant genitalia. Now I'm going to hand this one over to Sofie.
No, but this is the whole problem, is that this is why I brought it up, because I'm not actually sure. Like, I've heard I understood it as a kind of something that might be composed in private and approached with privately, but then if it was publicly disclosed would be quite a scandal, because it might be in higher classes like you're talking about, where kind of marriage arrangement might be more prevalent. That might be like disruptive to arrangements that are already in place, for instance, especially if some kind of lower class male, for instance, like composes a mansonger like poetry type thing to a higher class lady. But I'm not entirely sure that's kind of what I was posting originally. But yeah.
That's why this type of poetry, in so many ways, like all of it is built on layered meaning in different ways, so that you're capable of delivering a message that will be understood in one way to one person and in another way by another person, right? Mm-hmm. That's the genius part of it. So, like, for instance, you can compose a love poem to this. Say you are having an affair, and say it's a situation like you just described, Sofie, with a lower status male who is infatuated or having an affair with a higher status female who is betrothed to some funky duke or whatever of Western Iceland. Well, they wouldn't be called dukes, but magnate, I think we call them nowadays. Then he would be able to compose a intricate poem to her that she would be able to understand, based perhaps on references to their mutual experiences and other things they have talked about in secret, which is a very common theme, talking man and woman talking in secret, right? And then that would then be a message that could be delivered to her by, for instance, her servant or something like that.
Oh, this is getting even more bizarre, because I was just assuming you would just go and tell her face to face, but things weren't getting written down either, I assume. So no. This was a case of he's made this poem, he's put his heart and soul into it, then he's had to go and tell the servant and be like, look, don't laugh, but I need you to tell her these exact words, don't mess it up. And then she has to, or the servant then has to go and tell her this really romantic poem that might be a little bit rude or might not be. And I think that's just hilarious. But some things never change, because we on our website we sell gift boxes and we allow you to make like put a little note in there. And I think people always forget that somebody has to write that little note. And the amount of times that we've had to write like things like, oh, to my Ragnar, love from your shield maiden, and like we really weird, like, well, not weird, but like really like emotional kind of stuff. And that's why it made me chuckle a little bit, because it just reminded me of this kind of, there's just some things just don't ever change, like the things that you do for love.
You should read Bosa Saga and then get inspired when you're writing those little notes.
Oh, I just write what they tell me to.
Oh, okay. I thought you actually sometimes had to like write something yourself. No.
They usually leave what they want, and it's usually something soppy, and it's mostly like very Viking bro-y of that kind of typical thing. But it just made me think of that, like how embarrassing that must be to have this poem and tell it to the servant and then send her off. And what if she gets it wrong? What if it's like, that Whispers game where she gets it all wrong and something comes out the other end that's not actually what you said?
Yeah, then you fucked up, man.
It's just a whole different world I didn't even think of.
But this is one of the reasons that Scaldic poetry, especially the meter in Scaldic poetry, is so intricate and difficult, because basically it is designed to be memorable and to be kept in memory. And if you mistake one word for another, then you might screw up the whole meter. That's the whole deal here. So that means that in principle, you should be able to remember it and not screw it up. And that would be the situation then that we're also dealing with. This is why so much Scaldic poetry is used as historical sources by those people writing the sagas in the 1200s. Because they basically are laboring under the theory that, well, if Scaldic poetry is composed correctly, then it is accurate knowledge, which sounds perhaps a little strange when we're dealing with poetry. But there is something perhaps to it, because it would be able to be preserved intact without your memory screwing it up through several generations.
I mean, also, if we're talking about like the awkwardness of like these romantic Chinese whispers situations, I mean, in other sagas, you've also got like really weird accounts, like in like Njal's saga. Is it Gunhild, when she is betrothed to Hrut or I think it's Hrut. And he goes back to Iceland and is due to marry somebody else other than her, who she expected to be married to. I think she manages to place some kind of crazy curse on him where he's unable to consummate his new marriage out of pure spite. And I think then the new lady might be like able to divorce him on account of him not being able to perform consummation. Like, so you wonder how much of that stories like this perhaps are kind of like based off of awkward situations that needed some kind of like superstitious solution. I don't know if you know what I mean, but yeah. So
and that's what the hell is that saga? The Fox guy. Why am I blanking on it? There's this one saga where it basically seems like a underlying theme of the saga is homosexuality, and the person who is sort of accused of that is damn it, why am I forgetting the name of that guy? Like but the interesting thing is that there's a lot of like curious poetry in that saga as well. And in one situation, he ends up killing a guy by stabbing him and basically like stabbing him with a spear so that he's like stuck to a fence or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then he goes to the king who's present in the town at the time, and he basically declares that he has killed this person with a riddle. And the interesting thing is that the king, of course, like immediately understands what he's saying. And that's always like the assumption that the highest ranking people in society are educated to that level, that they are capable of like deciphering riddles like this, just like that, which, you know, of course is sort of like, you know, reference to Odin as like the god that is in charge of all of this, and the source for it.
So last thing on this, how accurate, I know you said before they would, if written down, they should be remembered correctly, but how accurate would the context of them be if they were written down by or created by kings wanting to remember their stories?
Oh dude, it's all propaganda.
Well, that's what I mean. So how much can you, like, as a historian or a scholar, look into it and look at it as being historical evidence, or is it just kind of like you have to take with a pinch of salt?
So one thing before I answer that question, the saga I was referring to is Crockett saga. So that's Href the Sly in English. Okay, so this is where it gets really tricky. Of course, we know that the content of a poem, like a Scaldic poem about, say, Harold Finehair's death, that of course, gives us a information about his death and his life as well, and some battles he was in, and those kinds of things. And then we have to trust various auxiliary sources in different ways for details. The way that they determine time for people's life and such depends on who we're talking with at what time in medieval history and medieval Iceland. So Ari Fróði, for instance, he writes Íslendinga book. He tells us that Iceland was settled in the period from 870 to 930, and he dates the beginning of the settlement of Iceland based off of Harold Finehair's reign, and he uses the English royal lines as a sort of like a backup for making sure that he's got the time right. He didn't. We realize like archaeological evidence shows that people were in Iceland already in the beginning of the 800s. So he got something wrong. Mm-hmm. But up until a couple of years ago, when archaeologists found a settlement from the beginning of the 800s, that had been the standard explanation for when Iceland was settled, 870 to 930, because Ari Fróði said so, because he based it off of like the reign of Harold Finehair. And that's basically what we have to go on with a lot of this information, right? So if Snorri Sturluson tells us that, Þjóðólfur or Queenie lived from this and that time to that and that time and so on, then we have to simply accept that. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot we can do to otherwise authenticate the existence of that person within that time frame. So, yeah.
Because I feel like if I was a king and I was on my deathbed, I'd issue some people to write some really awesome stories about me, whether they were true or not. I'd be like, look, tell everybody that I did all this amazing stuff, killed at least 10 dragons, a bunch of bears, and surely that's what they must have done.
Of course they did.
so how much of that lives on today? That
so much of it, so much history writing, especially in Scandinavia, is based off of these random propaganda stories that kings came up with. That's literally what any Norwegian hears in history in elementary and middle school, right? That's like Snorri Sturluson's random lies about Norwegian kings, called Heimskringla. We know that he is lying about so many things, especially about the early kings, but it's just accepted as the story about what happened back then. And that's the same thing for a lot of other things. One of my old colleague, just posted on Facebook the other day. He's a medieval historian. He's reading all kinds of chronicles and stuff. He just posted that he found an entry in the so-called Stada Chronicle that of the Danish king Valdemar the First also was crowned king of Sweden by Barbarossa of Germany. So yeah, and that's the only source that I know of that professes that this guy was also king of Sweden. And I'm wondering how the hell did that get in there, because it's a big deal to say that this guy is also king of Sweden, right? That's it's there's got to be some Swede that was wait, what?
We can safely say J.K. Rowling probably read that one.
Maybe.
It's I'm sure it sounded like you said Voldemort there.
Voldemar.
Same thing.
It's the Scandinavian version of Vladimir.
Oh.
Sven, did you I can't remember, did you bring up Eyvinder Skaldspiller, the kind of one with the shitty name attached to him? Was he not the one who composed Hákon Amal, like the kind of lay of Hákon the king?
Yeah, I believe so.
That one is kind of a strange example to me, because I think Hákon was this Christian king who attempted to introduce, please correct me if I'm wrong, but attempted to introduce Christianity and was kind of shunned away for this. And
it's actually the other way around, it looks like. That's the interesting thing about him, because it's Snorri Sturluson. It's Snorri who's saying that Hákon that he attempted to introduce Christianity, but then he was like faced with all of this pushback on the evil earls of Merrier and all that stuff. And actually, it kind of like all the other sources about Hákon are basically saying that he was like, yeah, sure, he was baptized in England, but then he came back to Norway and he was like, fuck Christianity. And then he just went with it.
Well, ignore everything I was just about to say then. Like, you can completely discount everything that was about to follow, because that poem was confusing to me in the context that I thought it was in, before you literally just told me that fact. So yeah, that's fixed it all for me. Thank you.
Well, there you go, right? Yeah, no, so
solid.
This is really interesting, because that tells you a little bit about like the process of Christianization too in Norway and like the influences. Snorri Sturluson, if he is actually the one who has written Heimskringla, because there's also, a debate about that. But I mean, it's really interesting to consider that he is representing all of this as like, oh, actually, Christianity sort of like came to Norway much the earlier, but it was just because of like these pesky earls up here who didn't want to submit to it, that it really didn't gain foothold. And then we had like this king who was like, this is devout Christian, and it's like, everything else we know about him seems to suggest that he was definitely not a devout Christian, and he did not care. So it's just
because in the poem, it's for context, there's confusing sections about like Hákon showing trepidation about entering Valhalla because Odin is acting very hostile to him. So he's kind of like, oh, I don't feel welcome here. Like that's the kind of vibe that the poem gives off. But then the fact that he is still welcomed by the Valkyries and his time will always be thought of as good.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of my previous understanding of this has just been washed away anyway. So like, I'm completely happy with my new learned knowledge about this. But I always found it pretty baffling, that entire strange relationship and like, between religions. So thank you. Fix that.
Well, much obliged.
There we go. He gives us all those moments.
Educated. Thank you.
So before we wrap up, I'm not going to let you get off lightly without asking you about your old Instagram name. I said that I was going to. So your Instagram handle now is I'm not going to try to pronounce it.
No, go on. You have to now if you're going to bring up this subject.
I support it.
Daugaskald, something like that. Daugaskald.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's fine. Yeah, Daugaskald.
I'm just playing this cool. I had it the whole time. And your old Instagram handle used to be?
I don't know. What did it used to be?
You're going to have to say it.
This was one that I looked at so many times to see if I was reading it wrong. I thought maybe it was meant to be split up into two words and I was reading it wrong.
This caused confusion, so I can add a story after you pronounce the name. I'll add the rest of the story.
So I always knew your Instagram handle as Odin's Scrotum or Odin's Crotum. And I always found it so bizarre. And I wondered where the fuck that came from. Because you had it for quite a long time and you've got a lot of followers as well. So I was just like, why that?
I mean, it's a really disappointing answer because there's not really like a very exciting reason. I mean, I think right before I went to Norway on my degree about 4 or 5 years ago now, that's when I kind of started that account. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. And for some reason, I grew up with like lots of friends, but none of them interested in Nordic mythology or any of this shit and like the kind of music scene or whatever. So I kind of thought like, oh yeah, obviously there's academic interest, but there's not really like an interest among my age group. I was completely blind to it. So before I went to Norway, I was like, I'll start an Instagram account and share snippets of the Scandinavian studies lifestyle, like the essays and things like that, because I'm the only one doing it, completely naive. And then I sort of like began that account under Odin's Crotum, or Odin's Crotum, as some people thought it was, which led to a lot of weird confusion.
Well, part of me was hoping that I didn't know what Crotum was, and I was like, it wasn't what I thought it was. I was like, it can't be Odin's Crotum. It has to be something else. And I mean, I spent a good 10 minutes maybe looking at it, trying to figure it out.
But maybe that's the only reason my name didn't get banned. It's the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I did mean a Crotum, like a lot of people messaged me thinking I'm in. And I quickly realized I was a very small fish in a very large pond of people who actually were interested in this shit. And I was like, oh God, I'm no longer like the only person I know in the world who likes this stuff. But, you know, it was humbling in a good way. I've met friends for life through this, but I had no idea that other people like this stuff. It was just completely went over my head. And to answer your questions, I'm sort of dodging around it, aren't I? The problem is there's no reason. I can't remember what the reason is. Like Odin's Scrotum, I think I did mean it as Scrotum. It wasn't Crotum. Just to clear that up. And I just thought it was fucking funny. And I thought it might make me stand out a little bit.
That's as good a reason as any. Was there alcohol involved?
Maybe. A lot, bit. Yes.
A little lot. Yeah, there usually is. I mean,
Fun. It was the mead of poetry.
There you go. Yeah, that makes sense.
Didn't even get to that. I completely forgot about that.
Yeah, it was divine inspiration of the mead of poetry. It compelled me. But I had plenty of people messaging me saying, "I've never heard of a Crotum before. What is it? Like, is it a Viking weapon?" And
wow.
It was a really.
I would have trolled them so hard.
No, I did, but I did a little bit, and this turned into a really stupid ongoing joke. So, like, I replied because my dad messaged me. My dad found the account, and he said, "Odin's Scrotum. So, what is a Crotum?" And I was having some kind of stupid day, and I said, "Oh, it's a weapon from the Vikings. It has 2 balls." And he was like, "Wow." It was like, wow, he was like a morning star, like a mace morning star, but with 2 balls. So I was like, yeah, that's basically what a Crotum is. And
I mean, that's your dad. You've got to.
No, but I posted a screenshot of that on Instagram, and people didn't get the sarcasm. And I had a lot of people genuinely inquiring about the Crotum. And then I had a blacksmith message me and offer to forge a Crotum, and he photoshopped it. I've got it on my Instagram highlights if you want to watch the saga unfold, because it's so stupid, but it really made me laugh. And so that
I feel like I would pay for a blacksmith to make a Crotum.
I don't want to spoil anything, but that might actually be happening.
I love it.
That.
Also,
and he can have spikes. He can have spikes in the balls. There's little pubes.
And there's your one-eyed Odin.
That's my one-eyed Odin. Wow.
The one-eyed Odin and the Crotum.
Anything that's sure evidence. Then
I have no idea where this is, how we got here, what's happened, but I love it. I can't believe anybody believed that.
No, they did, and like my dad did, and then I thought everyone would laugh at my dad, and then everyone was just like my dad and thought the same. But there is a Crotum potentially in the works for the future. Watch this space. That's all I'll say.
So. There is.
It's it might be It might be a miniature version with quite small balls, but it's in the works. So,
hey, it's your invention. It can be as big as you want it to be. Right. On that note, let's wrap this one up. You will you'll have to come back.
Oh well, with the Crotum flailing around.
Okay, right. We've had some. Oh, right. I've got a few tears in my eyes now.
I'm just happy it's not my fault this time.
Oh, I don't know. I think you set it up with the big dictionary, and then from there it seemed to just spiral downhill. Okay, so no, let's I don't know why this tickled me so much.
Stop, me too.
Right, okay. When the Crotum is made, please come back and join us, and we will.
I will.
And we will speak about the media poetry, which we were meant to do today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure we can make pretty much a full episode out of that. Matthias, you said there's plenty of different variations and
multiple dick metaphors in it too. So yeah.
Well, I feel like a Crotum in hand will be perfect for that.
Perfect. I'll do it. It'll make it happen.
Okay. Yeah. We will. You just let us know when it's made, and then we will.
Absolutely.
We'll book it in. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Do you want to get? Okay. When other people laugh, it makes me laugh as well. That's the problem.
No, it's also because Matt wrote, "I'll bring the ham."
I'll bring the ham. Which
will be balls deep in the poem. Oh, fucking hell.
Oh my god.
I think Vicagra is the best one.
Yeah, Vicagra.
Wow.
Vicagra is a good one.
There's someone said there's pills for small Crotums. Good. That's good to know.
Wow. Yeah. Oh cool. My god. No, this might be the best one. Odin's Crotum will be a symbol 1,000 years from now. Right. We have to make this happen. In 10 years, I think we need to make a Crotum the new Viking symbol. And it
will.
It can be the new Vigvisia.
Be like the new Mjolnir tattoos, but a Crotum, two-balled Crotum. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, wow. This is my new task in life is to make that happen. Right, let's wrap this. I've said this about 3 times. Let's wrap this up. Do you let people know where they can find you? Obviously, they can get your book when that comes out. I know you said it'll be a few weeks before you release that. So like I'm Daugaskald on Instagram, and I think I keep pushing it back, but my first book should be out in 3 to 4 weeks' time, and it will be available on my Etsy and some other web shops, but I can't announce where they are yet. It's kind of a surprise, so I'll be announcing it soon on my Instagram. I think you should change your Instagram handle to a Crotum image, and we can just refer to you as the artist formerly known as Odin's Scrotum. That will make my life.
I did have a couple of requests to make some special merch T-shirts with a 2-balled flailing Crotum on them, so I can make that happen.
Perfect. There we go. Matthias, where can everybody find you?
You can always find me on Instagram. Just type in my name and I shall pop up.
There you go. Okay, I'm going to try and get through the rest without laughing. Okay, if you enjoyed the show, silliness and all, please leave us a 5-star rating, a positive review, preferably on iTunes. It helps people find the show, keeps us high up on the list, gets us in the charts, lets people find the show. If you enjoy the show and want to get involved a little bit more, Patron always helps us out. You can support us on there from £5 up to £20. You get different things for each tier. You get access to the bonus show that we do straight after this one every week, which is where me and Matthias sit down and watch an episode of Vikings and let you know our opinions, our thoughts on it.
This time we're going to be watching, isn't that the temple at Uppsala? you're going to be hearing me like bitching so much about that. It's going to be great. Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah,
So you get to watch that. You also get to sit in on the live shows we record. Get to join in the chat and the live chat feature, which is always good fun. It's always really funny. You can follow us on Facebook at Nordic Mythology Podcast, the same on Instagram, and our website is nordicmythologypodcast.com. And you can pick up some t-shirts, hopefully a Crotum t-shirt in the future. So yeah, no, this was fun. It descended into chaos in the end, but hey, that's
perfect kind of
brilliant.
chaos.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for spending the time.